Welcome to Talking Point from the Church's Fellowship for Psychical and Spiritual Studies.
Thin spots towards a rationale of holy places. Michael Paternoster. Canon Michael Paternoster, who was, until his retirement, the rector of St. James Episcopal Church, Aberdeen, gave the following paper at the annual conference of the Church's Fellowship for Psychical and Spiritual Studies at Durham, on the 3rd of September 1993. It may reflect the language and attitudes of the time in which it was written. Responsibility for opinions expressed herein rests solely with the author, and such opinions must not be taken to represent those of the CFPSS. What makes a holy place holy? That is the question I intend to address, though I am by no means confident that I can answer it convincingly. Indeed, there may be more than one answer, since there is, it seems, more than one category of holy place, and even in any one instance it may not be possible to find a single completely satisfying answer. As a first rough classification, let me divide holy places into three kinds: those that are deliberately, one might almost say, artificially, created, those that acquire holiness by association, and those that seem to possess intrinsic holiness. I am deliberately not defining holiness as such, at least to begin with. Holiness is what people perceive as holy, and that covers a range of meaning and experience which cannot be neatly cordoned off before we begin the inquiry. It can only emerge as we proceed. I want to begin with the deliberately created holy place because while it can, in a sense, be dismissed as not the real thing at all and therefore not worth investigation, the process of successful or unsuccessful creation of holy places may shed light on the origins of the more authentic examples, as well as on the psychology of those who are drawn to holy places. You may have read A Morbid Taste for Bones, a medieval whodunit in which Ellis Peters introduced her fictional detective brother Cadfael, one-time crusader turned monk of Shrewsbury. That fiction was based on fact, the translation of the bones of Saint Winifred from their original resting place to provide Shrewsbury Abbey with a saint whose shrine would attract pilgrims, and therefore revenue. One of the strange unforeseen results of Ellis Peters' invention is to provide the present custodians of the medieval abbey with much-needed income as readers and, latterly, television viewers. In their hundreds and thousands flock to Shrewsbury to follow in the footsteps of a fictional character. In the story, the bones conveyed to Shrewsbury with such pomp and ceremony are not really those of Saint Winifred at all. What is historically certain is that in the year 1138 Prior Robert took from Gwytherin in Denbighshire bones that he and everybody else at the time believed to be those of Saint Winifred. Whether Saint Winifred ever really existed is a moot point, and the status of the miracles attributed to her, both in England and Wales, is at least open to question. What the story illustrates very clearly is that in the Middle Ages, possession of what purported to be the relics of a saint was a much sought-after and potentially lucrative asset. However, the acquisition or invention of saints did not always work. Take the case of William of March, Bishop of Wells from 1293 to 1302. The medieval monarchy, permanently hard up, paid its ministers and civil servants by giving him ecclesiastical preferment, and William's real job was to be treasurer to Edward I. In 1295, however, he suffered the fate of Norman Lamont and was dismissed. Having nothing better to do, he devoted himself to his diocese, such a rare distinction for a medieval bishop that it earned him a certain reputation for sanctity. By 1324, the chapter of Wells was trying to get him canonized. The sick were encouraged to pray at his tomb, and a careful tally kept of anything that might count as a miracle. To recover from sickness at all at that period might well be counted a miracle, but it has always puzzled me to know how one can, with any degree of certainty, ascribe any such improvement to the specific intercession of an identifiable departed individual. As it happened, William of March was never formally canonized, and the attempt to foster a local cult faded out fairly quickly. On the anniversary of his death a mass was to be said, and the fee of £1 was to be met out of the offerings at his tomb. By 1372 the amount in the collecting box for the whole year was short by 4 shillings and 4pence. By a century after his consecration as bishop, the takings were down to a shilling. Something similar happened at Hereford, where Bishop Thomas de Cantilupe was canonized. From 70 miracles in April 1287, the number quickly dropped to 2 or 3 a month, and by the time he was actually canonized in 1320 they had ceased altogether. Offerings peaked at over £178 and dropped after a century to less than £2 a year. It is doubtful whether either Wells or Hereford found their attempts to acquire a saint of their own altogether cost-effective. They would not have tried, however, if there had not been rich profits for the really successful shrines, as there still are. There is a story of an Irish railway company whose attempts to benefit shareholders by attracting trainloads of pilgrims were only frustrated by the local parish priest forbidding his people, on pain of excommunication, to have visions of the Virgin Mary. One can easily rationalize the failure of abortive attempts to create a holy place, but what do we make of the successful ones? Few of us doubt that Saint James the Great was executed very early on in the history of the Church, as recorded in the Acts of the Apostles. He had neither time nor opportunity to visit Spain, at the far end of the known world, and it is highly improbable that his body, whether by accident or design, could ever have been washed up on the Atlantic coast of Spain. Yet Santiago de Compostela is one of the major pilgrim shrines of the Western world, and even the Elizabethan Protestant Sir Walter Raleigh fell under its influence so far as to use the imagery of pilgrimage in his poem, Give Me My Scallop Shell of Quiet. What took people to Compostela in their thousands was a naive and mistaken belief that the pilgrimage would bring them into direct contact with someone specially close to our Lord. What do we make of this phenomenon if we no longer believe that Saint James could possibly be buried there? There are other highly successful shrines built upon equally shaky foundations. What are we to make of Loretto or Walsingham, for instance? Raleigh in another poem refers to the Holy Land of Walsingham, but can the Holy House of Nazareth really have flown through the air and settled out of reach of the infidel, to become a kind of tourist attraction? What these places of pilgrimage have in common, perhaps, is that they cater to a real need, even if the satisfaction they offer is largely bogus. Ordinary people love to make contact with the famous or the holy, living or departed. They feel the better for it, and are inspired to make more of their ordinary everyday lives because they have, however briefly, been lifted out of themselves. Life is a journey, and the quest or pilgrimage can be for many an outward enactment of an inward journey we all have to make. Not for nothing is the most famous of English Protestant classics called The Pilgrim's Progress. That many of the places to which people flock are not all they purport to be does not mean that the impulse that drives people to them, however inarticulate, is altogether mistaken. It is not superstition that motivates the pilgrim but the search for something authentic. If all too often he is served with junk food, that does not mean that no wholesome bread exists, or that it cannot be found. My second category of holy place is perhaps the easiest to understand, places that are holy by association. A good many National Trust properties are tourist attractions because of their links with the famous. People go to Chartwell because Churchill lived there. This represents a secularized form of the impulse that recognizes as holy the places where saints have lived, or where they have laid their bones to rest. If Compostela is a dubious example, Rome is a plausible one. Underneath St. Peter's, archaeologists have found what may well be the tomb of Saint Peter. What we call the Holy Land is, it seems, a wonderful jumble of places that bring the modern pilgrim into close touch with the people and events that lie at the heart of our faith, of places, probably authentic, so overlaid by tasteless and mistaken attempts to improve and glorify them that they have little authenticity left, and places whose identification is so implausible that only extreme credulity could be taken in by them. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre, for instance, stands a very fair chance of being in the right place, but no longer resembles in the least the place where Christ suffered and was buried. To get a better impression of what it was like then, one goes to the Garden Tomb, or Gordon's Calvary, which is definitely not Christ's tomb, but still looks like a genuine first-century sepulchre. It is a curious feature of the psychology of the guardians of religious shrines, that they frequently obliterate the original character of a holy place in the process of developing it. Take All Saints, Margaret Street. The old Margaret Street Chapel was, by all accounts, a plain and ugly building, but Newman, Pusey, and Keble worshipped in it. The brochure produced for the centenary of the Oxford movement in 1933 has a picture of them celebrating a kind of high mass in long Anglican surplices and Oxford hoods. Of that plain and ugly chapel, nothing now remains. It has been replaced by an ornate and ugly church. Two motives account for this destructiveness on the part of the custodians: the desire to adorn and beautify, to plough back the profits as they come in to make something beautiful for God, and the need to accommodate large numbers of pilgrims. They have had the sense to keep the village church in which the curé ministered for 40 years and the house in which he lived. Both are small and plain, but they have tacked on to the church an enormous basilica. R is a particularly good example of holiness by association. It was a village of no significance, an agricultural slum. It was not then and is not now a picture postcard village, but, in the year of Waterloo, John Vianney, who had struggled through seminary, was ordained and sent there. He stayed till he died in 1859. He was ignorant and superstitious, but he dearly loved our Lord, and he loved his not very prepossessing parishioners. His fame spread. At Lyon a special booking office was opened for R, which issued 8-day return tickets, as one could not hope to get a word with the curé in under a week. In the last year of his life, over 1,000 people came to see him. He said very little to them, and what he said sounds trite and platitudinous, but he left a great impression on them. He had been dead more than a century when I visited her, but the sense of the presence of genuine holiness was almost tangible, even if the whole village seems now to be given over to holy gift shops. Saint John Vianney had plenty of time to leave his mark on her, spending his entire ministry in the parish and dying at what was for those days the ripe old age of 73. Saint Therese of Lisieux was only 26 when she died of consumption, yet a visit to her hometown, a place equally given over to the sale of sentimental souvenirs, confronts one with the impress of a remarkably strong personality, strong enough to triumph over the suffocatingly bourgeois atmosphere of her home and the harsh and rigid atmosphere of her convent. I mention the Curé d'Ars and the Little Flower, because the places where they lived their very restricted lives have become places of pilgrimage where they themselves are still very much alive, and because of all the celebrated pilgrim shrines of the Catholic world, these are the two I happen to have visited, and the impression made on me is still vivid after more than 30 years. Of Lourdes and Fatima and Medjugorje I do not venture to speak, because I have not visited them. But the kind of experience I had at Lisieux and of a stone dropped in the past still causing ripples in the present, I have had in other places, sometimes quite unexpectedly. The length of time since a particular place was associated with a particular person does not seem to matter. In the cathedral at Durham Bede and Cuthbert are very near, but they are nearer, I venture to think, where they lived than where their dust is buried. Jarrow and Lindisfarne bring them back to us more vividly, though something of their personality is still there to be evoked, at their tombs. I recall in the course of a single day praying at the grave of Paul Irene Couturier, who started the week of prayer for Christian unity, and visiting the Cathedral of Lyons, on whose list of bishops Saint Irenaeus, who died in 200 AD, is not even the first name. In the library of Wells Cathedral I have been shown a charter with St. Dunstan's signature among the witnesses, and in the Scott Polar Research Institute in Cambridge I have been allowed to handle the prayer book Edward Wilson took with him to the South Pole. Moments like these annihilate time. Those whose hands held that book or guided that pen were once as alive as I am now, and indeed they are alive now, even though their bodies have crumbled to dust or been burnt to ash, or even if they are preserved forever in ice. We do not have to know much, or anything, about those to whom we are linked by standing where they stood or handling what they handled. Much of the holdover of churches which have been worshipped in for centuries is the sense they give us of being surrounded and upheld by those other lives of whom we shall never know much more than that they were once as we are now and we shall be as they are now. Precisely how this link across the generations is forged is a question I will leave for the moment and return to later. Already as we think about churches and cathedrals that have been holy places for centuries, we are moving into my third category, places that seem to have a holiness of their own. A modern church is holy by deliberate creation. A plot of land is acquired and built on, which might have been used for a house or a school or a pub, but which someone decided to set aside for a place of worship. Availability and convenience are the criteria. Is there a congregation to be served, and can a suitable building be put up at reasonable cost? No one troubles to align its east window by the rising sun on the feast of its patron saint. Indeed, the choice of patron is often arbitrary rather than inevitable. With ancient churches, it is a different matter. Often they occupy sites that were sacred before the first missionaries came. Saint Gregory the Great advocated a deliberate policy of taking over places that were already holy and rededicating them to the service of the one true God. Thus Glastonbury, which is probably the oldest Christian site in Britain, was already holy before the coming of Joseph of Arimathea or whatever anonymous group of Christians were the actual founders of a community there. There are those today who rather resent the taking over of ancient holy places by the Church and who try to reassert their pagan holiness. Both Glastonbury and Iona are centers of New Age devotion as well as continuing Christian shrines. And of course, in the wider world there are countless holy places of great antiquity that have never been Christianized. Christian response to pre-existing holy places has been ambivalent. Alongside St. Gregory's positive approach, claiming them for Christ, which can be resented as cultural and religious imperialism, there has been a strongly negative response, seeing holy places as the devil's laws to seduce us from the worship of the true God, as places to be desecrated and destroyed. Saint Boniface courted martyrdom by cutting down a sacred oak, and he stands in a long tradition, which stems from the vigorous attempts of the prophets and kings of the Old Testament to stamp out worship in the high places and sacred groves of Canaan and to centralize all properly conducted religious ceremonies according to the law of Moses in the temple at Jerusalem, which ironically was built on the site of a Jebusite holy place, served long before by the priest King Melchizedek. Equally oddly, Mecca, the central shrine of Islam, and like Jerusalem a place of devout pilgrimage, was holy before Muhammad was born, and was wrenched to the service of a new cult. Some holy places have been holy for so long no one can tell how they came to be regarded as holy. In other cases, we have myths and legends concerning their discovery. I use the word discovery advisedly. No one decided to make them holy, as one might decide to put up a church to serve a new suburb. Legend ascribes to the human founder only the discovery that these places were already holy, that some god dwelt there and made his presence felt by some unmistakable sign. Moses on Mount Horeb and Jacob at Bethel were, so to speak, taken by surprise. God spoke to them there, and rightly or wrongly they associated the place where they chanced to meet God with God's dwelling place. Though both of them, of course, were given to understand that wherever they went, God would go with them. Alongside these accidentally discovered holy places, there are legends of holy places discovered after deliberate search. The ancient Israelites had a portable God box, if I may rather irreverently describe it, the Ark of the Covenant, which was the sign and guarantee of God's presence, but where the Ark was to rest was left to God to decide. Even after the long trail through the wilderness, its location was shifted several times, largely, one suspects, under the pressure of political or military necessity, but always with at least lip service to the principle that God decided where the Ark should rest, giving a sign through some means that human beings could not too obviously manipulate, like putting the Ark in a cart and letting the cattle who drew the cart go where they liked and stop when they wanted. A somewhat similar process settled on Durham as the final resting place for the relics of Saint Cuthbert. With really ancient holy places we have either no way of telling when and how they were first marked out as holy, or we have myths and legends which cannot be taken at face value, but which may contain significant clues to understanding what makes a holy place holy. Doubtless, if the origin of all these holy places was as fully documented as those in my first category, we might find that with all of them there was a fair degree of superstition, misunderstanding, self-deception, or just plain deception. That does not mean that the category of holiness can be dismissed as a superstition that has long misled mankind. Over the millennia, countless people have traveled to places where they believed they would encounter holiness, they have prayed there and made their offerings, and they have gone home the better for the experience. One cannot dismiss all this as mere wishful thinking, at best harmless, at worst devilish. Obviously, no Christian can take at face value the stories associated with Hindu or Shinto shrines, or the classical legends that were until recently part of an educated person's mental furniture. Whatever makes a pre-Christian or non-Christian holy place holy, it clearly cannot be that Apollo was born there or that Shiva came there to play with the milkmaids. The gods that people these shrines are for us not real entities, they are mythical beings. Those who follow Saint Gregory will regard their worship as a genuine, sincere, but barely understood tribute to the divinity only fully revealed as the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. The missionary task for them is to say with Paul on the Areopagus, "Whom you worship in ignorance, him I declare to you." Those who follow Saint Boniface will regard the gods many and lords many of the pagans as real but dangerous beings, demons, enemies of God, whose worship ought to be totally extirpated. In a very general way, the dominant religious tradition in England has been Gregorian in outlook. Scotland since the Reformation has been Bonifacian. I am aware on the one side of the orgies of destruction committed by such zealots as William Dowsing, roaming East Anglia with a Bible in one hand and a half-brick in the other, and on the other of the never quite submerged tradition of Celtic spirituality, with its strong sense of another world impinging on the world of every day. All the same, when one crosses the border from Scotland to England, one senses a change. In England, the ancient parish churches have been centres of worship for centuries. Their history is one of organic growth, without violent discontinuities. In Scotland, a church is not seen as sacred in itself, it is simply a roof over a congregation. If they need a larger or a smaller place of assembly, they move, and abandon the old one to the elements, or to secular use. Scottish churches in general lack all sense of the numinous, they are just preaching boxes. English churches, whether or not the sacrament is reserved, are full of a definite presence, a presence of long-departed generations of worshippers who have filled it with their prayer, but also the acknowledged presence of the one who is worshipped. The Reformed tradition is well expressed by Karl Barth. God is the holy other, who dwells not in temples made with hands. The worship he requires demands of us a purely functional and utilitarian building. Aesthetic and historic associations are simply a snare. The General Synod of the Scottish Episcopal Church started this year with a Eucharist in St. Mary's Cathedral, Edinburgh, a Gothic revival building whose architect tried, even if he did not quite succeed, to design a church whose very stones would cry Alleluia, We then crossed the road to hold our meetings in Palmerston Place Church, borrowed for the occasion from the Church of Scotland, a pleasant and commodious auditorium totally, and intentionally, devoid of atmosphere. In regarding holy places as a snare and a delusion, Protestants and rationalists join forces. About the time I was ordained, the theological fashion was to applaud the growing secularization of the world and to see in the Bible itself the beginnings of a process of demythologizing. The scientific study and exploitation of nature was seen as the child of the Judeo-Christian tradition, as something that could only have happened in a religious climate that had begun to see the world as disenchanted, as the neutral background for human activity, from which the gods had fled and in which the true God, who did not interfere, had left man in sole possession and with full responsibility. Theological fashion has changed, with the emergence in the last 20 years into public consciousness of so-called green issues. We are more ready now to listen to the Native Americans for whom the soil is sacred than to the descendants of their Puritan conquerors for whom nothing is sacred. We have begun to see that the desacralizing of the world, with its attendant loosening of inhibitions, has not been altogether a good thing. If we are to survive and avert the catastrophes that present attitudes and policies seem to be rendering inevitable, we need to recover a reverence for life and for nature and a sense of our own rootedness in the world, things that the once vaunted emancipation of Western man has almost destroyed. For this reason, asking what makes a holy place holy is not an academic question. We desperately need our holy places, but because we are rational beings we need good grounds for accepting their reality. Reason may have got us into the mess we are in, but we shall not escape from it by a flight from reason. During the First World War, a time of unreason if ever there was one, Rudolf Otto, a German professor of theology, published a major study of the non-rational element in religion, the idea of the holy, in which he argued that the fundamental religious experience, on which the whole superstructure of doctrine, ritual, and institutions has been built, is an encounter with what he called the mysterium tremulum et fascinans. He, or rather his translator, has given us the useful word numinous to describe what is experienced in such encounters. Tremendum means something awe-inspiring, something to tremble at, something that fills us with dread. Jacob, awakening from his dream, cries, "How dreadful is this place!" This is none other than the house of God. But the numinous also attracts. Moses, seeing the burning bush, says, "I will turn aside and see this great sight." Otto speaks of what happened to Jacob and Moses as the primal numinous awe, which has undoubtedly been sufficient in itself to mark out holy, or sacred, places, and make of them spots of awful veneration, centers of a cult admitting a certain development. The development he sees is a process of explication and interpretation whereby the noumen is given a nomen, the divinity which appears to indwell or haunt the holy place is identified and given a name. If Otto is right, the whole edifice of organized religion rests on the first-hand religious experiences of people who have encountered something that filled them with awe and wonder but which also exercised a powerful attraction. Such experiences manifestly still occur. The files of the Religious Experience Research Unit founded by the late Sir Alister Hardy are full of numinous encounters. Sometimes, but not always, people who have such experiences continue to associate them with the particular place where they occurred, ascribing a peculiar sanctity to the spot where they happened to be at the time. Earth has ne'er so dear a spot, as where I met with thee. The places thus marked out do not have to possess the physical attributes of grandeur or sublimity. Clearly, there are those who encounter the universe as a thou rather than an it, in settings of scenic splendor like the Alps or the Lake District, or under the illimitable skies of East Anglia. But people quite often find themselves face to face with the divine in relatively commonplace surroundings. Exhorted as we are to worship the Lord in the beauty of holiness, we have to admit that beauty and holiness do not always go together, and the sense of the presence of God, or of the nameless other, does not necessarily come to us in places of natural or man-made beauty. It is a different emotion. For those who experience it, it is valid and compelling, even if it is not always communicable. One must ask, however, whether there really is anything special about the places where people happen to have had an encounter with the numinous, or whether they are just as likely to happen anywhere at all. Is there in fact anywhere on earth that is intrinsically holy? Was Jacob right to say, "This is none other than the house of God"? It has to be admitted that some places have given such an impression to a whole succession of people, not all of them noticeably religious or particularly impressionable. Take Iona for example. Kenneth Clark, in his television series Civilization, said, "I never come to Iona without the feeling that some God is in this place. It isn't as awe-inspiring as some other holy places, Delphi or Assisi. But Iona gives me, more than anywhere else, a sense of peace and inner freedom." Iona, of course, is one of those age-old holy places taken over, hijacked almost, by Christianity. Andrew Linklater, writing in the Daily Telegraph magazine, quoted a New Age enthusiast as saying that the great thing about Iona is that it is more witchy than churchy. I take that to mean that it is somewhere still capable of evoking Otto's primal numinous awe, however much it has been subjected to different interpretations over the centuries. The late George MacLeod, who founded the Iona community and set in hand the restoration of the Abbey ruins, described the island as a thin place, only a bit of tissue paper between things material and spiritual. I want to explore a little further the idea of thin spots. I do not know how widespread the belief is among the Scots, but the identical term was used by an elderly lady of my acquaintance who was of Scottish ancestry and believed herself to be possessed of what Scots call the sight. During the 40s and 50s this lady wrote, under the pen name M. Pardo, a series of children's books now forgotten, but popular in their day. Most are pure fictions, but in one, Argyll's Mist, she attempted to describe for modern children what life in Britain was like just before the Roman conquest, and used as a device to transport 3 children from the mid-20th century to the time of Cymbeline, not a time machine like Doctor Who's TARDIS, but an island off the Scottish coast which is a thin spot where one can sometimes encounter people from the remote past. To get back, once they are stuck in the 1st century, they have to stand on the Eye of the White Horse of Uffington and wish hard. What suggested this narrative device is revealed in an unpublished manuscript in which she describes a lifetime's experience of psychic phenomena. One incident related in detail happened to her son when he was a small boy, somewhere on the chalk downland of southern Britain. Searching for wild flowers, he had the terrifying experience of being surrounded by little dark men and refused to go near the place again. No one else saw them, but they were vividly real for him. Her explanation is that he did not see them with his usual senses, but was picking up something that had happened there many centuries ago. It turned out that the place where he had had this experience was a Celtic burial ground. She was able to reassure him that although he could see them, they could not enter his world, nor he theirs, therefore they could not harm him. For the purpose of didactic fiction, she removed this limitation and used the thin spot as a genuine gateway between our time and the remote past. In practice, however, although there are certain places where the barrier between this world and other worlds is so thin that you can see through, a quote from Argyll's Mist, the interaction is never complete. As Homer and Virgil remind us, you cannot embrace the shades. To sense the presence of other worlds, 2 conditions seem to be necessary. The first, as a character in Argyll's Mist puts it, is this: you have to happen to be on the thin spot at exactly the right moment, and you can't know beforehand just when that moment will be, and if it isn't exactly the right moment, although you may still be standing on the thin spot, you won't see anything. The second, as the author explained to her son, think of a TV. 9 out of 10 people only see what is showing on channels 1, 2 and 3. The sets they have inside their heads may have channels 4 and 5 as well, but the push buttons for them are missing. You and I seem to have the extra channels and the buttons, and somehow or other the right button for one of them sometimes gets pushed and we find ourselves seeing not the present but the past or the future. The television analogy is not perfect, but it does suggest that there could be a reasonable explanation for some people having psychic gifts and others apparently lacking them altogether. For the latter to set limits to the possible is like the tone deaf or the colorblind arguing that others cannot really perceive what is outside their own experience. In another important respect, the analogy does not take us very far, since what we are concerned with is not seeing ghosts but encountering the holy. Haunting, however, does offer useful parallels. As Otto puts it, the places set apart by Moses and Jacob are genuine, haunted places. Only the feeling of being haunted has in these cases not the impoverished and debased sense of our modern eerie feeling of being haunted by ghosts and specters. It comprises all the rich potentialities and possibilities of development inherent in the truly numinous emotion. In a footnote he translates Habakkuk 2:20 as, Yahweh haunts his holy temple, and Psalm 26.8 as, the place is haunted by thy majesty, and defines the Shekinah as, the haunting presence of Yahweh in the temple at Jerusalem. The numinous experience that gives rise to the designation of a particular place as sacred is, then, akin to haunting. Only it is not quite like haunting in the usual sense. Most of us would probably rationalize the phenomenon of haunting in one of two ways. Either someone who has died has not so far been able to sever his or her connections with the scenes familiar in earthly life, but is held back, perhaps by guilt or remorse or the sense of uncompleted business, perhaps simply by inability to come to terms with being dead. Such presences are naturally linked to particular places and may be making a deliberate attempt to communicate with particular people. Alternatively, the person who once lived and suffered here has now moved on to a higher plane or to oblivion, but a traumatic incident has impressed itself so deeply on the place where it occurred that it can be replayed time and again in the presence of anyone psychically equipped to receive it. An instance of the former might be the story that the last 13 cantos of the Divine Comedy could not be found after Dante's death until his ghost appeared and directed the searchers to the right place. Of the latter, an instance is the belief that the gallery outside the chapel at Hampton Court Palace is haunted by the ghost of Catherine Howard repeatedly trying to reach Henry VIII to plead mercy and repeatedly being dragged away again. Neither of these perfectly plausible ways of accounting for hauntings will explain why the saints should apparently be particularly accessible at places associated with them. Surely, saints by definition are not earth-bound but have entered into the joy of the Lord. They are, however, people strongly motivated by love and compassion, and they might therefore choose to return to where they can continue to be of service. One thinks of the Buddha who turned back from the brink of nirvana in order to help suffering humanity find release from the treadmill of existence. Or one remembers Saint Therese of Lisieux saying, I want to spend my heaven doing good on earth. There is nothing absurd in supposing that those whose will is most nearly aligned with the will of God continue to haunt places where their presence may still do good. Less and less am I convinced that there are specific places which in themselves, apart from what we make of them, are holy, nodal points of psychic energy akin to the magnetic poles. 2 years after the English translation of Otto's idea of the holy, there appeared what is to some an equally seminal work, The Old Straight Track by Alfred Watkins. His thesis, which I am bound to say I do not find convincing, is that the straight lines that can be drawn linking certain landscape features are not arbitrary or accidental alignments, but represent traces of prehistoric trackways. Chesterton is, I think, more likely to be correct. Before the Roman came to Rye, or down to Severn Strode, the reeling English drunkard made the rolling English road. Be that as it may, there is nothing mysterious about Mr. Watkins' tracks. He did not claim that his ley lines represent lines of psychic force, or that his markers were reservoirs of power. From his questionable but essentially rational thesis, there has grown a belief in some quarters that Britain is traversed by invisible lines of mysterious power like a prehistoric national grid. If you can accept that, then the markers on the ley lines, prehistoric tumuli, standing stones, clumps of trees or cathedrals, are objectively holy places, because they are places where you can plug into this occult power. I do not believe this to be true, and I find the evidence for it extremely unconvincing. The only significant detail in this scheme that I can accept is the often criticized tendency to use as markers on any line features that differ in date from the Neolithic to the medieval, since it is demonstrably the case, as we have seen, that many medieval churches were deliberately sited on spots considered holy from time immemorial. It seems to me more than likely that nowhere is intrinsically holy, but that places acquire holiness through the interaction of human beings with their environment, either natural or built. In most cases it is difficult to say which way round this works. In his book The Spirit of the Fens, Edward Story asks, is the spirit of place something we create for our own need, projecting our feelings into the landscape, making it accept us rather than we accept it? Or does the landscape itself have a spirit which we learn to recognize, absorb and draw from until, in the end, we are shaped by the very nature of the soil from which we came? Again, in a vintage detective story, Policemen in the Precinct by E.C. Lorac, the Norman Abbey Church is as much a character in the story as any of the people who live in the close. One character remarks, "I don't hold a brief for the dean and chapter, but the abbey does justify itself. It keeps craftsmanship alive. I sometimes think there's a soul in the very fabric of that building, and the masons and the carpenters and the skilled cleaners breathe it and become one with it." The detective, an outsider and a Presbyterian, replies, "I agree with you about the old masons and carpenters, though I myself should say that their souls went into the building and sustained it, rather than the reverse." The holiness of most holy places is an acquired holiness, the result of a long period of time in which a place or a building has been loved and cared for, and many people, ordinary people, as well as specially holy people, have given their lives to it. The starting point for such a process is almost always the encounter of an individual with the numinous, but that individual may misidentify the source of the feelings of awe and fascination. He knows that a God is there, but he may not correctly name that God. The numen may be given the wrong nomen. Still less may later generations get it right, as they elaborate myths and legends on a foundation long since lost to sight. There is an underlying question we have not tackled. Can anything material be the vehicle of the Spirit in such a way that through standing on a particular spot, touching a particular natural object or human artifact, looking at a particular view, natural or painted, we can open doors onto another world? Or is the experience, for those who have it, merely subjective, with no veridical or evidential value? The March 1993 issue of the Christian Parapsychologist reviewed the book Ley Lines and the Christian by M.R. Taylor. According to the reviewer, he believes it is impossible for physical objects, places, or lines to affect the spiritual dimension. Only people, or demons, can do that. The author has since protested that this is not what he meant to say, but if he did, he is not alone. I knew a priest who refused to bless the crib at Christmas on the ground that you can only bless people, not things. If so, I wonder what significance he attached to blessing the water at baptism, or the bread and wine at the Eucharist. Surely, at the heart of the Christian religion is the belief that the material order is not merely material, but is capable of being the vehicle of the Spirit. Even though explanation falters before the mystery of the real presence in the Eucharist, we are committed to believing that we live in a sacramental universe. And if it is, some places can be, by God's appointment, holy places. Henry Frankfurt and his colleagues in Before Philosophy speak of early man's sense of his environment as a thou rather than in it as something we have outgrown and can hardly comprehend, and note also the absurdity of claiming every temple, tomb, and sacred site as the original, holy hill. In fact, neither idea is as alien to us or as absurd in itself as they make out. Bishop John Taylor in A Matter of Life and Death speaks of what I would call a timeless moment, when looking out of a train window he saw a field of stooked corn, the stooks casting long shadows in the evening sunlight. The lovely scene, glimpsed briefly in passing, seemed to speak to him. It led him to ask himself what was the source of this current of communication that enables a landscape, itself inanimate, to act upon us, that turns it into a presence towards which we surrender ourselves. His answer, which led to the writing of the Go-Between God, was the Holy Spirit, the anonymous opener of our eyes. Our response is not nature worship but the gift of awareness. As to the Frankfurt's other objection to the validity of this way of thinking, perhaps logically there can be only one center, one primordial hill, and medieval maps show the world, and therefore the whole universe, revolving around Jerusalem, the holy city. However, the modem universe has no center, but that in fact frees us from believing that only one place, or at most a few special places, have a privileged status as windows onto eternity. Anywhere at all can be for us a holy place, a place of encounter. Rabbi Joshua ben Karka said, God spoke from a thorn bush, to teach you there is no place where the Shekinah is not even a thorn bush.
You have been listening to Talking Point from the Church's Fellowship for Psychical and Spiritual Studies. To find out more, please visit www.churchesfellowship.co.uk.